Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Combating Copay Program Fraud, a multifaceted approach to protect your program. I'm Sean Edwards, Director of Marketing Operations at World Congress. I'll be introducing today's webinar brought to you by TrialCard. TrialCard provides patient affordability, medication access and adherence, patient support, and clinical trial services on behalf of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Founded in 2000, TrialCard has connected nearly 33 million patients with over 15 billion in branded drug savings to date. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment and go over a few housekeeping items. First, you should be able to see a title slide on your screen. If you're having any problems viewing the webinar or encounter any technical difficulties, please use your chat box and send a question directly to me, the host, and we'll try to help you. Secondly, I'd like to explain how we're handling questions. Due to the number of attendees, participant lines are muted. However, if you'd like to submit a question for our presenter, please do so using the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please submit your questions to all panelists. Please note that we'll be monitoring the questions for anything urgent, but we want to respect everyone's time and try to keep this webinar within the allotted time frame. We will answer all questions in time to adjourn the program. Please do not hesitate to contact us or presenters with additional questions. And please note this webinar is recorded. You'll receive an email with a link to the video so you can view it again. I'd now like to introduce our speaker, Jason Zemcik. Jason is the product director for TrialCard's TC Compliance and Risk Management Solutions, which encompasses copay program fraud monitoring and detection, copay accumulator mitigation strategies, and government exclusion and anti-kickback safeguards. And without further ado, here is Senior Director, Product Manager, Jason Zemcik.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sean, and just want to say thank you to the World Congress team. We certainly appreciate this opportunity. You've always been a pleasure to work with. It's great to get to do things like this, and obviously, especially in the situation that we all find ourselves in, kind of looking for ways to still reach out and connect with one another and share ideas. So certainly, thank you again for giving TrialCard and myself this opportunity today. I wanted to say thank you to everyone that took time out of their day to join us. Obviously, our goal here is to be very informational, educational, hopefully leave you with some insights that can help improve your copay programs. So again, thank you for making the time to be with us here today. As Sean mentioned, and obviously as the webinar was advertised, we're going to talk about copay program fraud today. It's an area of copay programs that certainly has garnered a lot of attention recently. And we'll kind of go through some of the things that are impacting that, things that may be driving that, talk about some ways that you can identify potential aspects of your program that could put it at risk, and then go into some strategies for successful fraud mitigation and fraud prevention. So again, hopefully in the next hour, you'll learn a few things and come away with some ideas that can help you, that you can apply to your own copay programs to help improve, rather reduce your risk. So here's a brief agenda. I kind of went into from a broad standpoint what we're going to talk about. Things we want to really hit on here are some of the very common profiles. We tend to see a few common types of pharmacies that engage in this activity. So we'll talk about some characteristics of those so that you can get a sense for when you're reviewing your program and reviewing your data, what to look for. Obviously talk about the importance of a holistic approach to combating copay program fraud and why, as the advertisement talked about, certain elements alone by themselves aren't going to get the full spectrum and the best results in combating fraud. So we'll kind of look piece by piece what that holistic solution really looks like and how you can apply it to your program. Obviously, data is critical to any type of fraud detection, and looking at copay program fraud is obviously no different. So we'll share some insights on the role that data analytics play in this entire process. And finally, we'll wrap up with, before we wrap up with questions, we'll talk about how pharmaceutical manufacturers and their copay program providers can work together in a collaborative fashion to really gain deeper insights and be more successful in combating fraud. So before we start, kind of just to set the stage and sort of establish groundwork, we're going to lead off with a polling question, kind of gauge where you stand in terms of how you view copay program fraud. So Sean, I believe these are going to come up for the audience to vote. This first question just simply asks, what statement best describes your attitude towards copay program fraud? So you can see You can see the responses there. Either it's not significant for your program, in your opinion, you think it may be an issue, but you also are confident that your program is protected. Or finally, you know it's an issue, but you also feel that your program needs a stronger defense. So kind of take a few seconds there and think about that. Believe the voting's open. And Sean, I think once they're done, they have a few more seconds to vote, and then we're going to display results. Yeah, that'd be great, actually.
So coming in first at 39%, I'm not sure if my program is impacted. Coming in at second at 37%, I feel my program is adequately protected. And third at 24%, my program needs a stronger defense.
Okay, and that's fairly in line with what we see and what we would expect. So this hopefully will be very informative to the not sure if my program is impacted crowd, because in a lot of cases, that is the prevailing sentiment. It's kind of one of those issues that has started to bubble up recently, and so hopefully this will be very helpful there. And also that portion that said my program needs a stronger defense. That's a good lead-in into our next slide here. And as I mentioned earlier, the current market conditions around copay programs just sort of create the right conditions for this to become an issue. And as I said, it's really sort of bubbled up in recent years. When you think of the broader topic of pharmacy fraud, you generally think about a lot of Medicare, Medicaid fraud, obviously, just regular unlawful dispensing, pill mills. You always kind of think of those types of things, but rarely in previous years would you hear copay program fraud specifically mentioned in that conversation. And it's one of those things that a lot of times just kind of here and there in random occasions may have been stumbled upon. I know for our organization, that's how we really got into this, by looking at program data for other purposes, as we were doing some analysis for clients of ours, and just kind of catching things in claim activity and patterns from certain pharmacies that just sort of didn't, to use the old adage, didn't pass the smell test, didn't look right, which caused us to dig deeper, kind of make some basic investigation work, which led us into realizing that there actually is kind of a subset of pharmacies that are trying to exploit these manufacturer offers, and have come to realize, that they're available, and that it's an area that they can attempt to take advantage of. You see the news clipping displayed there on the left-hand side. Very most recent and the most prominent case, rather I should say, was at the end of 2019 in December. There was a federal indictment handed down in the Metro Detroit areas by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Michigan. 26 pharmacies in and around the Metro Detroit area were participating in a copay program specific fraud scheme that ultimately resulted in $46 million of total reimbursement money being taken from manufacturer copay programs. And so I think that event, which a lot that are listening today probably heard of, is what really kind of made it known that this is in fact a significant issue. It's obviously not the only case, it's just the most prominent that kind of brought it to light for a lot of people that may have been in that "I'm not sure if my program is impacted" category. But really, when you look at the last few years, and the introduction into the market of more high-cost specialty medications, combined with, obviously, as part of the market access strategy for brands, increasingly generous copay offers, it kind of just, as I said in the title of the slide, just makes conditions ripe for pharmacies, ill-intentioned pharmacies, to try to take advantage of these offers. When you kind of layer in the fact that a lot now have gone to being more available, as opposed to physical cards only distributed in physicians' offices. A lot of offers are downloadable via the web now. Kind of all of those things together have really set the stage for this environment where copay program fraud can occur. So really, it's something that, as the market has evolved and as the market has developed, rather, it's kind of just become more prominent, and something that manufacturers and their copay providers certainly have to pay attention to. So as we transition into our next slide, these are some of and we'll again, sort of some stage setting before we get into the actual process of how you identify offenders and how you deal with them. very common profiles of fraudulent pharmacies, and what we've come to find out through our investigation work and through our analytics work. The top one there is what I call, basically the no legitimate business pharmacy or minimal legitimate business. And essentially what these entities are doing is, they're a registered pharmacy. They tend to operate in states where every state, obviously the requirements, the credentialing requirements to obtain a license and open a pharmacy are different. So you tend to see them localized in certain geographies where they will pop up in areas where it may not be as cumbersome a process to get registered as a pharmacy and operate. They're not doing much legitimate business. Primarily what they're doing is running fraudulent copay claims and attempting to collect the reimbursement. So that's the one kind of the big standout profile of a fraudulent operation there. The middle one is kind of the opposite. They are in fact doing legitimate business, both regular claim transactions as well as copay claims. They're, kind of a standard operating pharmacy, and they're trying to basically hide their fraudulent activity in the volume. So whatever, on whatever cadence, they're just simply hoping that these claims that are illegitimate, fictitious, are going to just get lost, kind of washed away in the numbers and kind of go undetected under the radar. And then the final one, which I should have had that second after the no legitimate business one, it's because it's kind of a associated entity, is the pop-up pharmacy. And these are pharmacies that you see after that have some sort of a connection, whether it's through the same ownership or just some type of personnel or business connection. So after one of the no legitimate business entities would get shut down, you tend to see the same people or the same organizations resurface under a new NPI, under a new license, a new state business license. Something that they're trying to simply just get right back into the game and continue doing exactly what they were doing, just under another banner and hopefully not get detected. So those are kind of those are sort of the modes in which a lot of this occurs. The majority of them are going to fall into one of these three buckets. So this slide is kind of the overview of the entire end-to-end fraud process, fraud prevention process, I should say. And when we talk about a holistic solution, just like anything else that you approach, you want to kind of have it covered from all angles, start to finish, and see it all the way through. So hopefully this can be beneficial as you're thinking and applying it to your own copay program. Obviously, it starts up front, and as I say with anything, the greatest prevention or the greatest way to combat fraud is to prevent it from the start and not allow those that would commit it to even get involved with your program. So that starts up front with pharmacy credentialing. We work closely with our processors that support our programs. And they go through a vetting process with each pharmacy that applies to join the network. Everything checking out their credentials, their license, their insurance, and we'll get more into that on the following slides. But basically, trying to keep the would-be bad actors out from the start, because that's going to obviously be the most effective means of fraud prevention. The next portion, monitoring, that we'll again go into more, but it's just your kind of standard watching claims to determine the patterns of activity and determine what warrants investigation. The investigation right there in the center of it, that really is kind of the meat of the process, and that's the human legwork of really digging in and finding out what happened and the full details of the story. The auditing, so that's kind of the more formalized, really documenting your results and kind of having the grounds to take any action, establishing the grounds by which you're going to take any action against a pharmacy. And then finally, the refunding manufacturers. So this is something that we've established a process for in cases where, and it's not always able to be possible based on payment cycles to the pharmacy and different contractual terms and everything, but in cases where it's possible, being able to withhold payments that are due to these pharmacies and ultimately return them back to manufacturers. So we'll get in a little bit more into what that looks like in the coming slides. But that's sort of the 5 pillars of this overall process that we try to employ in combating copay program fraud. All right, so this is a good time to get into our next polling question. And the purpose behind this question, it's obviously very simple. Does your copay program have a formal fraud prevention element? Purpose behind this is, as I said, this is something that kind of evolves and grows over time. So a lot of times what we see with manufacturers is that they, or in turn their copay program provider, might be doing certain pockets of this process. They may be doing 2 or 3 things out of it, but as far as having a formal end-to-end holistic copay program fraud prevention capability, curious to see where the manufacturer copay programs stand on that topic. So if everyone takes a few more seconds to vote, and then Sean, just feel free when the results are in to share those.
Okay, 68% say yes, 32% no.
Okay, so about 2/3 do, and a third that do not, and fall into probably that bucket where you may be doing localized bits and pieces of this, but kind of don't have the full end-to-end process mapped out. So again, hopefully this is an area where you can kind of get some insights, get some framework as to what that would look like for your program. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to go a little bit deeper into each of these elements and kind of just talk about some things we've learned, some best practices and some thoughts. As I mentioned, pharmacy credentialing, it's ensuring that the pharmacies that even get involved with your network are on the level and are the types of stores you want dealing with your copay offer. So pharmacy credentialing, this is obviously making sure that the pharmacies that are going to be processing your copay offer are largely the ones that you want to be dealing with it. Obviously nothing is going to be foolproof, and especially when you're thinking about every pharmacy in the country that could potentially, sign up and join a processor's network to be able to process copay claims. You can't restrict every single one. It would become just operationally burdensome and unrealistic. But for the most part, weeding out the ones up front that should not be involved. So obviously every state, and I kind of used a snapshot of, I think it was New York on the side there. Every state has their own different licensing requirements to operate a pharmacy. They're all largely similar for the most part, but everyone is going to be slightly different. And as I said, that kind of is why we tend to see this activity be geographically localized. They tend to occur in states where it may be easier to get a pharmacy license if you're not really getting into it for the purpose of operating a pharmacy and serving patients. So things like ensuring that obviously their license is in good standing. They're both their pharmacy license, the pharmacist that's going to be the head pharmacist, and then also just the state business registration, whatever's required by the state, the county, or any type of permits like that, making sure that their insurance is current and up to date and in the appropriate amount, just all the legal and administrative things, making sure that those check out before a pharmacy joins your network. The other thing too that I need to mention is obviously this is largely dependent on the relationship of your copay program provider with the processor or processors they work with, because in a lot of cases, obviously the pharmacies will be contracting to join the network of the processor, and then your copay program provider, of course, will work with the processor to adjudicate claims. So I think kind of the takeaway as a manufacturer is to sort of just ask and inquire about that relationship, your copay program provider with the processor, and kind of how closely they work together, and how they handle the credentialing aspect for pharmacies. The bottom point there that I wanted to just bring up for thought is, an open network versus a closed network. So we see both with copay programs. Sometimes pharmacies or sometimes pharmaceutical manufacturers will want to be really tightly control this and operate a closed network where they can go even deeper and more extensive in the vetting up front and only allow even fewer pharmacies into the network. Whereas other, kind of the baseline scenario is the open network, where any pharmacy in good standing that passes all the baseline checks that I mentioned is going to be able to join the network. It's not, there's not really a decision on if they can join or not, other than just, them meeting all the requirements. So obviously with the open network, you're gaining access to a lot more pharmacies and a lot more patients because it's less restrictive to join. So there's, more pharmacies out there that can run your offer. But you are, as I said, it's impossible to control every single pharmacy that joins that network and ensure that they're not going to be one that attempts to run fraudulent claims. Whereas with a closed network, you have more operational requirements, more administrative requirements that take resources both to do upfront and then to maintain the currency of, to reevaluate those more strict credentialing measures, whether it's on a quarterly or an annual basis. But you have greater control over the level of pharmacies that enter your network. So that's just a decision, kind of a cost-benefit decision that has to come into play for the manufacturer and in conversations with their copay program provider. Claim data monitoring. So this, once you have your pharmacy network established and your offer is in the market and claims are happening, this is really kind of what kicks off the entire real fraud process, the active process when the offer's in the market. I always make the analogy, this is very, very similar to how financial institutions operate on what your bank does. I think we've all kind of seen the scenario. You get an alert that you spent an amount of money that's inconsistent with your typical transaction patterns, or your debit card or your credit card was used at a place that you haven't been before, you don't typically go, or something about a transaction that kind of caught the algorithm and made it say that this may not be legitimate activity, and you either get the alert or you get the phone call or something from your bank that says, we need to verify, was this actually you? It's very similar with monitoring claim data. So I know in our case, on a daily basis, we have a series of algorithms that run. They evaluate all the claims processed that day, and they look for a number of different criteria. And the middle bullet there is something I really wanted to key in on, because you need to examine both claim activity as well as attributes of where that activity is happening. Because kind of looking at each piece sort of in a silo doesn't really give you the full picture. Because, for example, if we take something pretty basic like volume of claims, obviously to have the context of what stores, what pharmacies these patterns of activity are happening at is going to really tell you whether it's something that warrants further investigation or something that's probably fairly normal. And then the other thing to mention is on the bottom, this is sort of a very iterative process, and kind of the more you do it, the better you're able to get at it. So as you identify more and more offending pharmacies, kind of analyzing the characteristics and the attributes of those pharmacies and feeding that back into the algorithm to create more precise fraud profiles. And in our organization, that's what we call them, profiles of pharmacies that we have identified. And so when future claim activity happens and the processing pharmacy meets any of the criteria of some of those profiles of pharmacies we've already identified, it triggers the algorithm. So that is one, in a way, good thing about this, is the more you do it, the better you're able to get at it, and the more you're able to refine it. So the middle portion of the continuum, if you will, the chart that we looked at up front, is the investigation process. And this is the active, as I like to call it, the legwork. This is the human element. So the monitoring, obviously, is the data and analytics portion. The investigation process is the human aspect. And you really have to have both of those to really make this successful. And a lot of other presentations that we hear, I know a lot of us probably attend a number of the conference events and where we listen to panels. And I think every enforcement panel that I've been a part of or listened to has had where you hear U.S. attorneys or OIG or anyone in kind of a law enforcement capacity talk about. They always hit on the point that you have to have both data and a human element, because again, it's all about context and understanding data and interpreting data and what it really means within the context of the environment. So the investigation process, it's very, very simple, but hard to do well. There's a lot of learning involved, and we certainly went through a lot of that. And it's based on, foundational law enforcement principles, understanding how to ask questions, how to search for information, how to research, how to uncover sources of information to arrive at a finding of fact or a reasonable conclusion as to what the finding of fact is. Our organization, we've established a fraud investigation team, bringing on individuals that have that background, healthcare fraud investigation. A number of them came from insurance plans where they were kind of doing largely the same thing, just obviously not with copay programs, just more in a traditional healthcare fraud setting. We're looking to really validate the information. So when you see claim activity that appears suspicious, whatever is triggered by the algorithm, that becomes basically the input to the investigator's work queue. So pharmacies on a daily basis get identified as having something in their data, put them on the list. And that list is what then the investigators start with when they do their investigations. And really, they're doing things like trying to get to the prescriber, find out did they write this prescription? Is this one of their patients? Trying to find appropriate documentation, just all the things you would think of in a traditional, straightforward investigation setting. Ultimately, what this leads to is it's the information, it's the basis to support a recommendation to remove the pharmacy from the network. So when we do these, it culminates with an investigation report, not uncommon to any type of investigation, and there's a confidence level of how likely it is that the activity is fraudulent. And in our processes go up through our trades director, who manages our relationship with our processors, and finally gets signed off by our chief compliance officer after reviewing the facts of the case and the findings. And this is what then you kind of use as your documentation, your basis when you work with the processor to have the pharmacy removed from the network. So the next step then, this kicks off the formal auditing process. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key things to keep in mind here in most cases, the pharmacies are going to have they're going to directly be contracted with the processor. They're not going to be contracted with your copay program provider. So in terms of what that means for the fraud investigation and auditing and ultimately removal process is the copay program provider is going to use the results of their investigation to then go to the processor and say, we'd like you to remove ABC Pharmacy, and here's why. Contractually then, in most cases, the processor is going to have some sort of a formal audit process outlined with the pharmacy that they will then go through. It's kind of very similar, just requesting documentation, asking for something to substantiate was this real claim activity, and if the pharmacy is unable to provide that, that is then what forms the grounds for terminating them. And again, keeping in mind there are contractual terms and timeframes and response times and everything involved likely in that pharmacy's relationship with the processor. One of the things that we have been able to do and establish, and this is going to be depending on the relationship of the copay provider and the pharmacy, and the processor, and then the processor's contract with pharmacies, is the ability to withhold funds. So at the time an audit commences, any payments that are due to that pharmacy and from there forward go into basically an escrow account, and they're withheld pending the results of the audit. And then if the pharmacy passes the audit, they're cleared and they get those payments that are due to them. But if they fail the audit and they're removed from the network, that then provides the ability to refund those dollars back to the manufacturer. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the following slides. So that's kind of the overview of the audit capability. Again, it's going to look somewhat different in every scenario depending on the parties involved. But largely the thing to take away is that that's an event occurring between the processor and the pharmacy. And the final piece, as I alluded to, so refunding manufacturers. So as I said, we've established a process where from the time a pharmacy goes under audit, there are payments that are due to them can be withheld. And this is something that obviously is specified contractually in their relationship with the processor. It's something that you're not always going to be able to. We always have to be very careful and caveat this when talking about it, because every pharmacy, per the terms of their contract with the processor, is going to have different payment cycles. So a pharmacy could be engaged in a lot of suspicious activity, but if they're not under a formal audit, those payments, there's nothing stopping those payments from going from the processor out to the pharmacy. So again, it's all depending on when the contract specifies that funds, if or when the contract specifies that those funds can begin being withheld. What we've done then is got on a cadence with the processor that at the end of every quarter, we sort of perform that final closeout reconciliation of all the funds associated with pharmacies that are removed from the network due to failed audits. Those funds then come back through us, and we in turn issue that back to the manufacturer. And we've done that in a couple different ways. And this, again, it's going to be program and manufacturer specific. Some, it's in the form of a check back to them. Others, it's on a credit to their next invoice. The one that always gets tricky is when you do Q4 of any year, because you're dealing with crossing purchase orders from year to year. So as we went through the end of 2019, some wanted to get it all in and get everything reconciled on the 2019 PO that they had for their copay program, whereas others, we kind of went across years and had to figure out with the manufacturer's finance team, how we work that out since it was a new PO for 2020. But really what it just boils down to is whether it's your program manager or your finance contact and their counterpart at the manufacturer or both, it's whoever is involved in that process, just communicating about how it's going to look. Because in concept, it's very simple. But what we've learned is in actuality, once you get it established, it can run very smoothly. But it does take some thought and some deliberate effort to get it up and running and working the way you want it to. So a good time here to stop. I know we went through a lot, trying to keep us on pace and stay within the time, but good polling question number 3. So for those of you that said your program does have a anti-fraud capability, sort of going back a earlier step, and now as you think about this in kind of the holistic frame, does your process involve data only? Is it a simply manual investigation and someone identifying suspicious activity as they see it? Combination of both, or I know we did mention there's some that don't have a formal anti-fraud capability. And then Sean, of course, whenever the results are in.
Okay, coming in last at 5%, data analysis only. Tied for last, manual investigation only at 5%. At 18%, we have my program doesn't have a formal anti-fraud capability, and at 73%, a combination of both.
All right, that is very good. That's very heartening to hear, because it's that was one of the key tenets, and like I said, it gets mentioned all the time in any conversation about this is, reliance on just one or just the other, you're simply not getting the full picture. So definitely good to hear that that's, programs that are doing this, they're trying to combine both elements there. So this slide, a lot of it is material that we've covered throughout this course of this discussion already, just by nature of what we talked about. But really the point of it is to simply hit home on how data drives the anti-fraud process. Data is what kicks it off. And I think that the really important point to make is the criticality of refining your data analytics capability and your algorithms, as I mentioned, establishing those fraud profiles and then not letting it be kind of a set it and forget it, but kind of a constantly iterative process. Analyzing the claims to identify the pharmacies that you investigate and ultimately exclude from your network. But then the feedback loop of putting that back in and analyzing what are the attributes of these pharmacies and how in turn do we then change, update, add to our fraud profiles so that we can identify more pharmacies and be more precise. Another thing I wanted to highlight, and I don't have it specifically called out on here, but is looking at data sources outside of just copay claim activity. And we'll get a little bit into this when we go into the manufacturer and copay program provider collaboration strategies. But looking at things like pharmacies that get involved in other types of illegal activity or just other sources of information that you can use outside of a copay program claim data set to say kind of identify or flag someone so that when they do have any activity, you're able to catch that sooner rather than waiting until maybe they have enough volume of claim activity, or they're, whatever they violate, or whatever element of the algorithm causes them to pop up is severe enough that it gets caught. So kind of preventing them from being that category of pharmacy that's able to fly under the radar for longer. It's really important to constantly improving and refining your data analysis capability. And then finally, the middle point there, data is so critically important, but at the same time, it's only the first half. The data is the input then to the investigation, and the investigation in the audit is what really brings it home, not only from a business standpoint and an operational efficiency standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint, because something that, if we go back to that very first slide and we talk about, the pharmacies that were involved in the federal indictment, then obviously there's a law enforcement element to that, and manufacturers that certainly in that scenario are trying to recoup funds and have grounds to do that. So that's where the investigation becomes even more critical in making sure that it's done well, it's done thoroughly, it's appropriately documented, all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, so that you can then support whatever follow-on action your organization wants to take based on those results. Which is a good lead-in to our last of 4 polling questions. What results does your anti-fraud capability produce? In some scenarios, we're simply blocking pharmacies, keeping them out of the network so they can't process future claims. Other scenarios, as I mentioned, there is a law enforcement element to it. And so curious to see organizations, are you making reports to law enforcement? And are you returning, or are you receiving returns of funds through your copay program? Or simply, is it the value of not allowing that pharmacy to continue, but basically it's kind of a situation of what's done is done. And the funds that are already processed, the claims that are already processed through that pharmacy, you're not able to recover those. So take a few seconds, enter your votes, and be very curious to hear where everyone falls. And Sean, whenever we have everyone in.
Okay, coming in third place, report offending pharmacies to law enforcement at 14%. Second, return of funds from claims through offending pharmacies, 27%. And the winner, block offending pharmacies from processing future claims, comes in at 59%.
Okay, and if I had to wager on that, that's exactly the order I would have expected. And the reason is that kind of outlines the level of complexity to each action. Obviously blocking a pharmacy, excluding them from a network, that's there's a process, it's involved, but that's the least cumbersome thing to be done. When you have to work out how do you get funds back and the process behind all that, that's a little more involved than simply cutting the pharmacy off and not allowing them to process future claims. So not surprising that came in second. And then when you get into law enforcement, it becomes increasingly more complex in making reports, and obviously there's an element of having it becomes increasingly more complex because obviously you're dealing with all the legalities around that. So not surprising at all that that's how it shook out. And these are all areas that could be considered for how you handle your anti-fraud program. Some cases it may or may not make sense to do certain things. Obviously I think the blocking pharmacies is always what you want to do. That's the baseline goal of any fraud prevention program, is to keep the offenders out. And the return of funds, I think that's, as I said, there's always going to be scenarios where it's just you're not able to catch them, no different than any other type of fraud or any other type of crime. It happened, they got away, and the money's out the door, and there's little that can be done to recover it. But also, as I said, the more you establish this process, the more you're able to shorten that time frame from investigation to audit to blocking, and prevent payment cycles from occurring and lapsing in between. And then finally, reporting to law enforcement may not be appropriate in all cases. Obviously I think we all it's an emotional topic, so to speak. It's fraud. You're dealing with money. And if you're on the manufacturer side, it's your program, it's your budget, it's your company's budget, and it's ultimately it's funds that are meant to go to support patients. So I think it really touches everyone. But at the same time, when you're dealing with reporting to law enforcement, as I said, there's legal costs involved. There could very well be subpoenas and court appearances, and depending on what all would be involved and the amount that you could potentially recover, that's why there may be some scenarios where it just simply it wouldn't be worth it. It would detract from continuing on with your program and your mission of supporting patients. So it's a scenario that you have to evaluate in each specific case and determine what the appropriate response is going to be. So the last thing I want to talk about is collaboration strategies for pharmaceutical manufacturers with their copay program providers. The first one, I can't make the point enough, information sharing is key. And I'll speak, just from our organization's experience, we have kind of this ongoing dialogue with a number of our manufacturer clients around their anti-fraud program. Obviously it's a capability that we operate as part of our copay programs, but as I made the point earlier, it's definitely not something that you treat as a kind of set it and forget it sort of offering. It's not like you lock the door and it's copay program fraud prevention is turned on and you don't think about it again. It's an ongoing process. We're sharing information with them about what we're learning, what we're seeing, what pharmacies we're excluding, what some of the landscape, what the landscape looks like, what the trends and techniques are that are being used. And in turn, they're kind of feeding us back thoughts and ideas and, questions they have that oftentimes drive us to make improvements in our program. So, definitely sharing information and collaboration. And that kind of leads right into that middle bullet point that I have. Is sometimes it's very effective to actually formalize this. And again, we've done this with a number of our clients where we have, and it's called something different in every scenario, but basically a task force, a working group, committee that deals sort of with all the involved business areas, everything from program operations, legal and compliance, our data analytics with the manufacturers, data forensics or data analytics or whatever data science people, whatever the department is in their organization, everyone kind of getting together and sharing their piece of the pie to really sort of paint that holistic picture and have that collaborative effort and sort of, in the spirit of we're all in this together, but actually being able to gain deeper insights when you're working together. Kind of one example that I'll throw out is kind of something that comes out of this is realizing that when you look at on the manufacturer side and the copay program provider side, there very well can be data that each party doesn't necessarily have access to. And when you combine that data, you're able to get a more thorough picture of what's going on. So kind of a good example would be looking at wholesale data and shipping data to see where did product go, and ultimately then combining that with copay claim data to say, why are we getting claims from pharmacies that didn't receive shipments? Now, obviously understanding that that's not, again, in and of itself is not sufficient to indicate that there's fraud going on, because many pharmacies are part of groups or other, larger organizations, and they may not be the end recipient or end purchaser on a lot of the shipping data, on a lot of the sales data for a product. But at the same time, it's something that, by looking at the copay claim data alone, you're not going to have that insight to say, oh, maybe we should investigate this pharmacy. So that's just one small example of how it's kind of by forming that collaborative team and manufacturer and copay program provider partnership, you're able to gain better insights into everything that's going on. And finally, fraud prevention begins with offer design. When you look at your program, obviously you're not going to, just for the sole purpose of preventing fraud, put a offer value, put a benefit design on your copay program that simply is inconsistent with your product in the market and what you're trying to accomplish. Obviously the lower the potential gain, the less likely of a target it is for fraud. But at the same time, that only goes so far depending on what the market is in your therapeutic class and for your product. But there's other elements of program design that when you work with your provider, things like what's the enrollment process look like? What fields are required when someone enrolls versus what fields are optional? And, because how that could prevent a pharmacy from trying to fake enroll patients or fictitious patients, just put in names and addresses and whatever other information is required. Similarly, with an activation step, is an activation required for the offer, or is it pre-active? Is it downloadable via the web, or can you only obtain a physical card through your doctor's office or something like that? So these are all things that as you're going through when you're starting a new copay program and you're working with your provider to kind of go through that design process and establish your business rules, thinking of it from an anti-fraud perspective is very key in being able to kind of start off on the right foot up front from a security standpoint. And finally, just some last best practices, and I know we have a few questions, so I'll go through these quickly and get to those. Establishing operational efficiencies for your investigative team. This is kind of the basics of any operation. Doing it as efficiently as possible, because the goal, really two goals, are to investigate as many pharmacies as they can and get through those investigations as quickly as possible without, and this is very important to say, without sacrificing the quality of them. And so even to that end, having the controls in place within that investigation to make sure that all the appropriate things are done, in that sign-off process of the report, so that if steps A and B are done, but C, D, and E aren't, a conclusion can't be drawn from that report. It comes back, when it goes through the approval process, through your compliance team or whoever the end approver is, making sure that all the right things have been done. But at the same time, putting resources and putting tools in place to enable the team to do that efficiently. The other part, and this kind of could be a full hour discussion in itself, is thinking through how to handle appeals and reinstatement requests. So when you go through the investigation process, obviously there's undoubtedly going to be pharmacies that, it's fairly obvious and it's a fairly open and closed investigation. And some, quite frankly, simply won't respond to whether it's the investigation or the audit or anything. But there are going to be ones where there is a legitimate reason why their activity patterns are what they are, and you'll get calls from them, or rather your copay program provider will, and they'll say, why are we blocked? Why are we not able to process offers? And then they'll say, here's, what do you need to see from me to get me back in the network? Because there are ones that simply they are on the level, and so having a process to handle those, and what's the formal method by which they go through that and get back into the network. And then the last one I already kind of touched on, just that defined case review process. It's really just basic checks and balances to make sure that everything is done properly, done right. Corners aren't cut, and if you're making a recommendation to take any action, it's well-founded and it's supported by facts and information. So those are just some things there. Best practices in any type of business scenario that are obviously very applicable to a fraud prevention program for copay. So at this point, that's all the information I have. Again, I hope it was very, very beneficial and educational to everyone, but in the time we have left, I'd be happy to open it up. I believe we have about 10 minutes, so I'm happy to open it up and take any questions.
Okay, Jason, first question in. Can you briefly talk through the process for determining if a claim is fraudulent?
We can, yeah. So really, the key thing to think of is you're not necessarily going to look at every claim down to the claim level. Really what this is based on, and just like any type of fraud data and analytics, whether, again, I use the bank analogy a lot, or any entity, you're looking largely for patterns of activity. And that's for the first initial identification of a pharmacy. Basically, do they warrant investigation? So things like, as I said, we can't go into the full detail, obviously, and every organization, I'm sure, has their own proprietary methods and their algorithms that they use. But in a broad sense, you're looking at just anything, anomalies, outliers, things that don't fit the expected behavior pattern based on the offer, based on the drug, the price of the drug, the market, the geographic area, attributes of the pharmacy store, things, characteristics of how that offer should behave in that environment, that geography, comparing it to other analogs in the area, things like that. Just identifying anomalies and outliers. When you get to the investigation process, that's where you're kind of digging more deeper into the claim level. Again, you're not able to look at every single claim from a pharmacy. In some cases, you may be, depending if they only kind of pop in and try to run a few and pop out. But for the most part, you're not. So you're going to have to take a sample size. And so having kind of whatever the appropriate formula is to establish your sample size. And then things, again, trying to confirm or deny, is this valid? Is this a real patient? You'd be surprised how many times we talk to physicians' offices and their staff, looks up and says, no, this person, they don't exist. We've never seen them. They're not one of our patients. And quite honestly, they're appreciative that we're doing this because they don't want the doctor's name and NPI associated with this type of activity. And were it not for that investigation and reaching out, they wouldn't know. So those are the things, kind of just the basics of confirm or deny. Is this legitimate activity? Did this happen? Should this happen? Or not? And again, within every organization, the exact method as to how that's done is going to vary slightly, but that's really in a broad sense what it involves.
Okay. And do the pharmacies have to submit documentation showing prescriptions, dispensing, et cetera?
So that's ultimately going to be governed by their contract with the processor. And as I said, I can speak from our organization, the processors we work with, we're not even entirely involved with, we obviously can't control the contractual agreement between those two. Obviously we have discussions with the processor and about the goals of the network and the fraud prevention program. But when they go through that audit process, it's not uncommon for that to involve submission of documentation, because again, it's getting into being able to prove or disprove, is this legitimate activity or not? And that's in any scenario, not just pharmacy fraud investigations. That's just kind of the basis of any investigation is, do you have proof to substantiate this? So that's fairly common for that to be required.
Okay. And are certain states more attractive for serial or pop-up operations?
They are, and I'll say that simply because the data says they are. As I mentioned, we've seen a lot of this activity localized in a couple states, and you can speculate as to why it is. I haven't researched it in excruciating depth, but things, as I said, like how easy or difficult it is to get licensed as a pharmacy, how easy or difficult it is just to get whatever the business licenses required are. Things like that tend to, be kind of indicators of in a geographic area if there's going to be more or less fraud there. But yeah, probably the best way to answer that question is that we have definitely seen a geographic localization of this type of activity among certain states.
Okay. And any ways you would suggest monitoring payer patterns and activities on the plan or design impact of a copay program?
Could you say that again?
Sure. How, if at all, would you suggest monitoring payer patterns and activity on plan design and the impact to a copay program?
I see. I think if I interpret that the right way, it could be useful because if a drug's payer coverage tends to change, that could make the copay offer more or less attractive, which could cause an increase in the volume of copay redemptions, copay claims. And what that could then lead to is sort of opening up the door for those pharmacies that fall into the try to hide it in the volume category. There could be more volume for them to try to hide it into. So I don't know how much impact that would have on the ones that are kind of outright fraudulent, the pharmacies that are outright fraudulent from the beginning. But I think it would stand to reason that if a copay offer becomes more attractive based on its value to the patient in consideration of their coverage, that could potentially enable more attempted fraud just based on there's more sort of volume to hide among.
Okay. And Jason, you mentioned that reporting fraud to law enforcement may not be an action all manufacturers want to take, but what, if any, additional recourse could a pharma company take?
So the first thing that I'll say is obviously we're not, we wouldn't want to get into the business of giving any type of legal advice, and most pharmas, they have their in-house general counsel and their legal department as well. But things like there could be, you could work with your copay program provider to kind of put more restrictive business rules in place for your program. Maybe if you don't want to go the route, or the cost benefit isn't worth necessarily going down the law enforcement route. We have been in scenarios where, based on what we've learned through fraud investigations and pharmacies that we've excluded, we've gone back and, at the manufacturer's request, put a change into the program business rules that would attempt to prevent the type of scenario that just happened. And it's something that, again, it's part of that idea of it being an ongoing process and feeding your learnings back into your process, not just the fraud side of it, but also into the copay program. So that's the first one that comes to mind, I think, is just adjusting your program to kind of not allow the conditions that were the basis for the fraud happening.
Okay. And what is a pharma company's liability to detect fraud?
A liability in terms of the manufacturer, their responsibility?
Yeah, responsibility.
I wouldn't, again, I'm not, I can't speak from the legal side of it. Clearly I'm not a lawyer. I know each organization has their legal department, and they kind of make those interpretations. I wouldn't think it's more of a liability or a responsibility as much as it is an aspiration. In fact, even probably a better way to answer it would be from our seat as a copay program provider. Obviously we have contractual agreements with the manufacturers we work with that speak to what our responsibilities and what we are contractually obligated to do in operating their program on their behalf. So there could potentially be elements of that. And as part of that agreement, the manufacturer to the copay program provider, the manufacturer may have some obligations, kind of a scenario of, in order for the copay program provider to adequately carry out and administer their program in the manner they want, they have to provide certain informational inputs, or they have to participate in certain processes that can enable that. So that type of responsibility, that type of liability could exist. I know from our end, obviously there's the contractual piece, but we look at it also just from the responsibility piece, in not legally enforceable responsibility, but just good business responsibility. Obviously the manufacturers that we work with, they put their trust in us to run their copay program. We kind of have this attitude and this belief and culture within our organization that there's a patient at the end of every copay card. There should be a patient at the end of every copay card, and if there's not, that's not right. And that's something that we take very seriously, the responsibility to constantly be improving, constantly be doing the work to ensure that happens in as few cases as possible. So I think that's kind of where responsibility comes into play, even outside of the legal responsibility and contractual obligations, which certainly do exist. But then there's also the responsibility to do right and to do the best job and to continually improve.
Okay, we have time for one last question. So for those with a program, where should they put their focus? And for those without a program, where should they start?
That's a great question. I think with those that do not have a formal program, I think the first, and this is assuming you're running a copay program, you're not in the planning stage, but I think the first would be just obviously having a conversation with your copay program provider, and focus on those two key aspects, analytics and investigation, and just obviously determine what capability do they have? Do they have the capability? And then to what extent? And kind of, hopefully this webinar today gave some good groundwork and framework as to what are the things you should ask about. On the data side, one of the previous questions we got was an excellent question that could obviously be answered in a lot more detail when you're in a discussion with your manufacturer or with your copay program provider. What data elements can you look at for us? And how would you interpret those? And then, what ability do you have to validate claims? Those that already do, and I know I'm going a little quickly because I want to make sure we keep everyone on time, but those that already have a formalized fraud program, I think it's all about two things really. How can you prevent more fraud? Because reacting and chasing and investigating is obviously important. But the goal is to do as much of the upfront work in terms of pharmacy credentialing, expanding the scope of what you look at, so you reduce that time. You reduce the time from identification to investigation, and just keeping as many of the would-be bad actors out of the mix from the start. So that's one area really to focus on. The other area then is, as I said, just always have the mindset of that continuous improvement and iteration. You know, when you block a pharmacy, when you remove a pharmacy from the network, don't consider the job done. You have to have that feedback loop of saying, okay, what did we learn? What did this case teach us? And how do we incorporate that back in on the front end to make our program stronger for future claims and the future of this program? So that's a kind of a short answer. There's a lot more we could really go into, but in the interest of time, those would be the things I would highlight.
Great, and we are just about out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Jason from TrialCard for taking the time to deliver a great presentation. Just a reminder, this webinar has been recorded. You'll receive an email with a link to the video so that you can view it again. Thanks again for joining us today. Have a great day, and this now concludes our webinar.